Welcome to a brand new episode of IDTALK4ED Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning in to this podcast, I welcome you and I hope that you return for future episodes, especially after listening to this one that I know you'll love. And if you're a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, I welcome you back and I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and as always, insightful. So before we introduce today's guest, just a reminder for folks who are on YouTube, please make sure you subscribe by hitting that red button. That will give you future notifications on new episodes of the podcast and all things Identity Talk. And if you're listening from Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any other streaming platform, make sure you subscribe there as well. And for those who would like to submit a monetary donation to help contribute to the growth of this podcast, you can donate to Cash App with the handle IDTALK4ED, or you can donate to Venmo with the handle at Kwame SM. And to catch past episodes of the podcast, you can go to our main website at IdentityTalk4Educators.com. Thank you so much. So today we are going to be talking about a variety of things. And as you already know, I've spent 9% of my time on the African continent for the duration of this podcast. So I've had a chance to interview a lot of people from different walks of the world and in life. And I always get excited when I'm coming across educators who are on the continent doing the work and pushing it forward, because if you go to a lot of different African countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, there's still a lot to develop in terms of professional development, in terms of just understanding the basic tenets and nuances of instruction when it comes to teaching. And today's guest is somebody who is all about the work. She's about the mission. And I'm just excited to finally get her on. We've been trying to do this for some weeks, and I'm just glad that we have the opportunity to do it today. So without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Laureen Adams to the podcast to just talk about the work she's doing in Ghana, my homeland, and just her journey as an educator, which is a very, very interesting one. So let's bring Dr. Adams on to talk with us. Hello.
Hello.
How we doing?
We are doing well. How are you?
I can't complain. Anytime I get a chance to interview a dope educator, it's always a good day.
Oh, I love
So
that. I'm so honored to
yes,
be here. Thank you.
yes. Um, just to give the audience some context, I think you and I met. Was it LinkedIn?
Yes. So I was teaching a course about a year ago, a little over a year ago now, at Claremont Graduate University in Southern California for new teachers. And I was co-teaching it. And my co-instructor recommended your podcast as some of the reading material or listening material. And I listened and I was like, oh, this is fascinating. So I reached out to you and then we just started talking. But yes, it was on LinkedIn.
Yeah, and about a month ago, I had a chance to go back to Ghana because I still have a lot of family there, and me and Lori actually met in person,
Yes,
and it was
yes,
amazing.
yes.
Like,
So super awesome.
yeah, like it's always exciting to have the chance to meet with friends on social media because you're just like, wow, this is how you look in person. Cause we're so used to seeing each other on screens, and then to finally see each other in physical form is like surreal experience.
It is, but I feel like we had Zoomed a few times, so I felt like we had already met. I will say you
Yeah,
were much taller than I thought. But yeah.
there you go. But it's great to have you on, and Yeah, let's go ahead and get started because there's so much that I want to cover with you. And we always like to start from the beginning. So before you got into this thing called education, I want to know who or what inspired you to want to even get into this field in the first place.
So I was part of the last group of people who were admitted to the UC, University of California, under affirmative action. And the next year, admissions for students of color decreased dramatically in the UC. And so I felt that preparing students of color for education was super important. So all throughout college, I worked in the EOP programs to support high school students who were hoping to go to college. Many were first generation. And that was really important to me. But my mission in life since I was in third grade was to be an attorney, actually. And I went through 4 years at the University of California, Davis. And then I decided to spend an extra year studying abroad. And I came here to Ghana. And it was during my time here that I was just like, oh, there is so much misunderstanding between the diaspora and continental Africans. Like, we really need to think about what we're teaching specifically around history and culture. And I just felt really invigorated and did a hard pivot. Like, I was studying to take the LSAT and I was like, no, I'm going into education. It was just my entire life, one plan, and in a year it just switched.
And then now, fast forward so many years later, back here in Ghana, which we'll get to a little later on.
Mm-hmm.
So I know you spent time in New York, right? Before
Mm-hmm.
coming to the West Coast in Cali.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in knowing, going back to your own K-12 experience, and we all have had our ups and downs during those times and have learned some
Mm-hmm.
lessons now in our adult years that we didn't know when we were going through that schooling. Considering all that, I'm wondering if you experience any struggles, whether it be internally or externally, as far as embracing your own identity and showing up as your full self in the classroom and even other settings.
Yeah, so I think showing up in the classroom, I didn't struggle to show up as my true authentic self. I knew I was smart and I really liked for other people to know that too. So that's my place where I felt like I could shine. I would say socially is definitely where I noticed some internal struggles and external. Earlier in elementary school, children would make fun of my hair. I had like a little afro from like birth until sixth grade. So I always had a little round. It was dope, but I got made fun of for that. And I was just like, why? I don't get it. It's my hair. I had some white friends whose parents wouldn't let me come to their house to play. Sometimes the mother would let me come over, but I had to leave before the dad came home. And I didn't fully understand that until I got older, what was really happening. And then I think around middle school, and definitely in high school, I noticed how students were self-segregating, right? So outside of the classroom, when it was lunchtime or passing periods, breaks before or after school, it was all the Black kids are here, all the Latinos are here, all the white kids are here. And I thought it was really weird, but I remember when I was getting my master's in education, I read a book from Beverly Tatum, and I think it's called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And it explained it to me, like, again, something like I could see, I just didn't have the language for. And she talks about how young people really need to construct these racially affirming spaces. And so that's why we see kids self-segregating, because in school, that's when we start realizing there are differences in your life, or you will experience differences based on your race or the construction of race that is put upon us. And so I would experience some discomfort in some of that segregation, because in elementary school, we all kind of hung out together. And then we get to middle school, and people who are my friends for 6, 7 years, because I went from kindergarten to sixth grade at the same school, like, we don't talk anymore. And that was weird for me. But again, I just kind of adapted and self-segregated like everybody else.
Yeah, and I always find it interesting how we do that. So in my case, I went to a predominantly white high school. It was about 500 students enrolled in the high school, and out of the 500, I would say probably 15 of those students were of African descent. And then out of those 15 students, maybe 5 of them moved to the town where the school's located within the
Mm-hmm.
past couple years. So they didn't grow up in the town, which is predominantly white as well. And I can remember always looking for black and brown face, especially during lunchtime. There was a black table where we all just congregated and we would just talk and commune and just really build a relationship. And that was a safe space at that time. The only requirement was, oh, if you were black, okay, come on. Come on, join us. We didn't really have a whole bunch of criteria as far as who can be
Mm-hmm.
at this table. So that's how urgent, that's how dire it was to have a space like that, even at that time when I'm 14, 15 years old.
Yeah, absolutely. I started high school in Southern California. It was a huge high school, probably over 2,000 kids, predominantly white, I'm sure. But there were still a lot of black and brown students. And then the beginning of my freshman year, my dad got a job in Colorado, and we moved to this very, very small town. It was surreal to me. There was one traffic light in the town. I had to take like a bus to school. It was just, I lived in the woods. And there was only one other black kid in the school. And it was racist as hell. I mean, the school in Southern California was too, but I think people were a little more covert. People felt free in Colorado. I mean, I got called the N word. I mean, people just said really wild things. And so while there weren't a lot of black folks to congregate with, there were some Filipinas that were there, triplets, I remember, and some Latinas, and we all kind of formed. I guess it would be what we call like a BIPOC group now of people, and that we all hung out together because we also were not from there. All of us had moved there in our teen years, and it felt very strange. And that is what got us through. I was fortunate to move back to Southern California the following year, so I didn't have to stay there for my whole high school career. But I don't know what I would have done if I didn't have other folks that I could have socialized with, because it was hard to navigate academically when you're like a lone voice. If you're talking about racial issues in class or something, and you're the only one advocating for the experiences of Black and Brown people, and then you would go on a break and not have anyone to talk to. I mean, that would have been more soul crushing than it already was. So I'm thankful that we had that space there.
Yeah, and it's a space that's needed, and especially now with everything that's going on, those affinity spaces are needed more than ever. But you mentioned your father, and I wanted to take some time to talk about your father, Mr. Lewis Adams. And
Mm-hmm.
he was a veteran, served in the
Mm-hmm.
Air Force for many years at a time where you didn't see a lot of black folks serving at that time, particularly as engineers, right? So he was an aeronautical engineer, which is interesting because my brother is also an aeronautical engineer. So there's a connection there. He just has this fascination for planes and just
Mm-hmm.
building things like that, aircrafts. And yet the thing, this is during the Jim Crow era. So when you think about the treatment that black soldiers, black military folks received during the time, we think about the GI Bill, we think about just all that was going on, the segregation that was taking place. These were things that your father had to endure, even years after finishing active duty, served his time for the country and still get that treatment. It's just mind blowing. But I want to give you a chance to just share the impact that your father had on you and how much of his influence do you feel and even see in the work that you do as an educator?
Mm. Thank you for this question. So, my dad was one of the most brilliant people I've ever known. And he was actually my first teacher around Black history. So, he was like the fun facts guy. We'd be talking about something at the table, and he'd be like, "Did you know a Black person invented the first stoplight? Did you know a Black person did the first open heart surgery?" And he would say names and all this. I was like, "Really?" And then I'd go to school the next day and couldn't wait to interject at an inappropriate time and share something I had just learned. And so I always equated Blackness, being of African descent, with brilliance, right? And as you mentioned, my dad served as an aerospace engineer for many years. He retired as a full colonel, which is not common, especially for Black men. And he was the only Black person in his department for many years. So I can only imagine what he went through in those recent, the later years of his career. But I do have a few stories that he shared with me before I was born about his experience in the military. One was shortly after my mother and him were married, which was in New Jersey. He was called to go to Biloxi, Mississippi, to do some short-term work there. And so he had called some places to find an apartment, and he had appointments made to view the apartments ahead of getting down there. And then when he got there, they were like, "There's no vacancy." And he said, "But I made an appointment." And they were like, "No, you didn't," because his voice didn't match his face to them. So they thought they were talking with, a well-educated northerner white person, I'm sure. And and denied him. So he had a really hard time finding a space. And in fact, the Air Force had to intervene and help him secure housing. And then another story of in the South, like he was in full uniform and he was trying to board a bus to go back up north, I think. I can't remember where he was going. And the people on the bus, or the bus driver didn't want to let him on because it was a whites only bus. And
Wow.
the people on the bus actually advocated for him and were like, "He's serving our country, he's in uniform." And they actually convinced the driver to let him on the bus. And I'm just like, wow, when people dedicate their life to represent a country, which hasn't served them well, but that was his choice. And still, even when you're visibly supporting the country, people uh, try to turn you away. Like I can't imagine like having to carry that load.
Wow.
Did you interject?
No, I'm just amazed at the story, and I'm wondering how the experiences that your father went through paralleled with what you are going through while you're in school, because you're seeing these experiences and you're seeing these incidents as a child, and I'm just wondering, how is that process for you at that
Yeah.
time?
Yeah, so I think for my father, he really wanted to shelter me from some of those things. My dad was born in South Carolina, and then later in life, as part of the Great Migration, his family moved up to New Jersey for job opportunities. So I grew up mostly in California, and I think he wanted me to not experience some of the things he had to experience. So he was overly protective. He often felt irritated when I would point out things were racist. And I'm not sure if it was because to him it wasn't as bad as what he went through, or if he just didn't want to be reminded that it was something that his child still had to experience. But it definitely was a point of tension for us as I got older, because I became acutely aware of race the older I got, and I would always point it out, like, "Why is this happening? This. They said this to me at school. The teacher said I couldn't write about this person because da, 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 da," whatever it was. And I felt a lot of irritation from him, and I wasn't ever really sure if it was directed at me or just the circumstances. Like we were still living in a pervasively racist society. It was manifesting itself in different ways, and yeah, it was a pain point for him for sure.
But I also know that it's generational too. And I wasn't there when your father was going through it, but if I could take a guess, I would say that, he was fighting back in his own way,
Yeah,
combating those different forces. But after a while, you get tired. You get tired of fighting back all the time. And it doesn't mean that you don't want to resist. It doesn't mean that. It just means that, you know what, it's time for someone else to carry the torch or
right,
to take on the baton. Because we know that all these isms, the racism, oppression, um, segregation, all these things still happen to this day.
right,
And now you have a new breed of folks who are radical in their own right. and they're combating them in a way that makes sense to them,
Hmm.
in a way that works for them. So I just feel like it's kind of a wear and tear situation.
I agree. And honestly, it took me many years to come to that kind of understanding and have much more grace and compassion for him. When I was younger, I would be really angry, like, why are you telling me to stop talking about this? Why are you saying I'm overreacting? You know, whatever it was, I was just like, what's wrong? But as he got older and we got past arguing about political things all the time, he definitely softened, and I could see that it was just what you said. You know, it wore on him.
So then ultimately you started to teach in the classroom,
Hmm.
spent some time teaching in New York, and then eventually moved out to California to teach as well. So
Hmm.
talk to me about those early experiences in the classroom. What were they like?
Well, I'll say when I started teaching in the Bronx, I was at a school where almost all of the teaching staff were Black and brown. And that really excited me because growing up, I probably had a handful of Black teachers, maybe two. So I was just like, wow, you know, all of the kids were completely Black and brown. So I was like, this is awesome. I'm doing the work I want to do with the people I want to do it with. And the first year was rough because honestly, a lot of the teachers, many of whom were educated either in the Caribbean or Africa, were really oppressive in their teaching practices, right? So they had internalized a lot of the colonial practices of shaming, of only one right answer, of extreme discipline and being compliant. And I was just, I mean, it was more oppressive than what I remembered growing up in like with white teachers, you know? So I was just like, what is going on? And that was really unsettling. I also, I mean, again, I grew up in California. It's a little more chill. New York's
Yeah,
intense, and
very much
my
so.
students were intense. They were intense. I started teaching seventh grade there, and I was just like, these feel like old people who've been through some life, you know? Like it was just, I guess, the concrete, you know, living in poverty. There's so many things like immigrant families, you know, there's just so many things they're navigating. I kind of had one of those classic Bronx first year experiences. I didn't get my assignment until the first day of school. I ended up teaching a class I hadn't prepared to teach for. Thought I was only teaching English. I was also teaching history. I didn't have textbooks. I didn't have enough desks in my classroom. I had way too many students. It was like all the things. But I just really drew in on what I thought was super important. So relationships to me have always been my primary focus. Like create solid relationships with everyone, not just students, but your whole learning community, because that goes far, right? So that was something I knew how to do well already. So I leaned fully into that. And then I picked up a lot of things intuitively. I can't actually say that my teacher preparation program gave me these tools, but you know, thinking about what are they interested in, okay, so let me try to create some kind of lesson around that. Fortunately, I didn't have at first, my first year, a scope and sequence or a pacing map or calendar I had to stick to, so I had a lot of freedom, and so I was able to really, you know, try some fun things with my students. But it was hard. I mean, the way the kids spoke to adults, like I had never seen anything like that, and it was just, I had to switch really quick, like in how to navigate, how to communicate, you know, how to be relevant to them, especially as like someone from California, because they're like, what, you know, all the things. But it was tough. It was a tough first year, but it got so much better after I had a reputation and I came back the next year because a lot of people didn't last. So when I came back the next year, they're like, "Oh, she's here, cool," and it was a lot easier after that.
So this season, Identity Talk for Educators Live will be including ad spots for businesses, products, and events that are adding significant value to their communities. And here's the catch: you don't have to be an educator or an education based business to be a part of this. We're looking for people who are just doing great work in the community, and we want to use our platform as a way to amplify their work. So if you are an entrepreneur or you know of an entrepreneur who is doing just that, bring them in our direction. Have them reach out to us. If they want to learn more about their ad spots, and how they can get themselves promoted on this platform, they can contact myself, Kwame at IdentityTalk4Educators.com. I'll say it one more time. It is Kwame at IdentityTalk4Educators.com. Hope to hear from you, and let's keep on amplifying our work and building each other up. That's what's up. You weathered the storm.
It was a storm too.
Yes. So, as you were talking, you were mentioning the black and brown teachers who were there, who were from parts of the African diaspora, and how they were very firm in their discipline, how they're very rigid in their instructional approach. And I'm just thinking to myself, wondering, that must have prepared you for when you finally came to Ghana to do the work that you're doing now with a lot of teachers who do a lot of the same things.
Oh, absolutely. It's, I mean, almost identical, right? So
Yeah.
countries who were colonized by the British, like there's still a very British education system in Ghana, and the practices. Oh yeah, it wasn't new to me when I got here. It was
Right.
surprising to me that some of those practices are still so pervasive. But not fortunately, but I had prior experience to it. Also, I mean, I did study here for a year, so even at the university level, the instruction at the university level was very different than what I was accustomed to at the UC.
Yeah, for sure. And even off camera, I even told you about my experience in
Hmm.
Ghana when I was there for middle school. So at that time, they called it JSS, Junior Secondary School.
Hmm.
And I saw a lot of same things you mentioned. And I was just like, wow, like you can actually punish students with a cane. You could
Hmm.
whip them. And I'm thinking to myself, that's something you can do at home, but not in a classroom because you do it in the States. That's corporal punishment. You can go to jail for doing that.
Listen, I
So
had a few parents who, when I would call and talk about their kids' behavior, they're like, "Oh, you can hit them," and I was like, "No, I can't. No, you can. I'm giving you permission." I'm like, "Yeah, it doesn't work like that here." Just so you know, nor do I want to. But yeah, I mean, parents kind of expected teachers to handle it all.
I'm sure some of them were probably African teachers, African parents too.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
You already know. You already know. Oh man. But I tell you, it's definitely eye opening when you witness it. But I think back to that experience
Mhm.
as a 13, 14, 15-year-old, and I carried it into my years as an educator because I was like, they work so hard and they have such a narrow focus when it comes to academics, which can be problematic, but also advantageous at the same time.
Yeah,
Because you see how they perform at a high level, especially when you take them from that system and you put them in the American school system or even um, the UK school system. They're able
absolutely.
to compete with all of their other peers, and it's all
Hmm.
because of the preparation they receive. No matter how imperfect it was, there was definitely some benefits to it.
Right.
Yeah, so that's always interesting to think about. But now going back to your early teach years in the States and just your whole trajectory, because I know for myself, when I first started teaching, I was more of an observer. I
Hmm.
saw a lot of things that I knew were foul, and I just compartmentalized it and just kept staying in my lane. But
Hmm.
I was aware that these things were going on. And also, when you're one of the few black teachers in the building, you don't want to say too much because you put yourself in jeopardy of losing your
Hmm.
job. Like I will admit that for myself. Like I went through that. But then once I got tenure after a few years, that's when I started to speak up more. And the more I spoke up, the more I was butting heads with my principal and other administrators to the point where somebody had to go.
Yeah.
So that's how it was for me. I'm wondering for you, at what point in your career did you have that shift towards liberation, towards radical self love? Because in order for us to do what we do, in order for us to even make that shift, we have to have respect for ourselves.
Hmm.
We have to prioritize ourselves. So when did that happen for you in your journey?
Pretty early on, I would say. I think for me, I was very young when I started teaching, right? So I was 24. And not only am I brand new to the field, it's like my first real job out of college, I'm in a new city. And a lot of the teachers in the building were seasoned. I mean, they had been teaching for 15 plus years. So, I was kind of trying to get in where I fit in, and learning the cultural context of the Bronx, which again, as I mentioned, was very different than California. So there might be some things I would speak up about, like, this feels a little harsh. I remember my second year teaching, the school I was at got put on the New York City's Dirty Dozen, the 12 most dangerous schools in New York list. And so as a result, they brought in the NYPD to the building. And when kids acted up, they would be taken out of the room in handcuffs. And I'm like, yeah, this is causing trauma. Like I knew that then before trauma was a big language in school. I was like, this is not okay. It's not necessary. These kids are like 12. And they're in school. And developmentally, it's appropriate for them to act out because their brains are just wired that way. And they're testing things, like all the things. I was just like, this is not okay. So I had a lot of tension with administration around that, for sure. But I will say I was really fortunate to, after my first 2 years at that school, the school split into smaller schools. That was a big movement, small school movement. And I went with the newer school who had a really progressive uh, principal, and he had a lot of faith in me and really wanted me to take on leadership in the school. And so if you remember what I said about Ghana and one of the reasons I wanted to come into education, it was because there was a big disconnect between the diaspora and the continental Africans, right? And so part of my master's thesis was designing an African-centered English language arts curriculum, which I did, and I piloted in my class, and we talked about the experiences of African people all over the world and like looked at how there was similarities, where there was some differences, what caused these differences, just so we could learn more about each other, right? And it was such a success that the school adopted it, in every eighth grade English language arts class had to teach that unit of study. So I feel like early on, I was able to like tap into my purpose and serve in a leadership role. I would say the radical self-love part definitely took me a lot of time. And I don't know that I actually found that fully as a teacher. I think I've found it as a teacher educator because I sacrificed a lot of my well-being in service of what I thought was the best thing for students, right? Like, not sleeping well, not having any kind of social life, just wearing myself thin. And I did that the entire time I was in the classroom because it felt so high stakes for me. Like, this is life and death for these young people, and I want to make sure I do my very best all the time. And so, it definitely took a toll on me in many ways. And so now that I support teachers, I'm always really talking about how to find that balance because, yeah, it's great to do great work and have positive impact, but not if at the end of it all, like, you are just completely worn down and have no sense of who you are as a person anymore outside of being an educator. And so that took me a long time, I would say, after about 10 years being in education.
And I think the self love part is an ongoing process. I mean,
Mhm.
anybody that is going to therapy like I am, anybody that's doing any work around emotional intelligence and learning how to express and have empathy for others, you're
Mhm.
always going to be in that learning mode when it comes to radical self love. That's what I've come to realize. But you said something that I really want to connect with because you've been in Ghana now for how many years?
2 years. I've been coming back and forth for a few years prior to the move, but yeah, I've been fully living here for just over 2 years.
Okay. Now, just not even thinking back to when you studied abroad years ago, but thinking about these past couple years that you've been living full time in Ghana,
Hmm.
how has living and working abroad there helped to shape your identity and even your worldview as a Black woman? Because we know, I feel like you and I, we both have what I like to call Pan Africanist dispositions.
Hmm.
And a lot of that informs the work that we do in and out of the classroom. So I'm interested in knowing how all of those different facets of who you are mesh with what you've experienced in Ghana.
Hmm. This is a question. I'm gonna do my best to answer. First, I
We
want to
got
say
time.
that, yeah, I'm not always read as a Black woman here in Ghana. You know, I think for
Mm,
folks who've traveled or who are really tuned into Black folks around the world, I'm read as Black. But for folks who haven't traveled, I think people are just confused a lot of the time. So that's an interesting thing to navigate. But one thing I've become really aware of in work here is just that Black women all over the world really have to struggle against patriarchy. And here I see it in such different ways. And maybe I'm more attuned to it because I'm so used to associating patriarchy with whiteness. Maybe I know it pervades, like it's a pervasive thing. Everyone, deals with it to some extent. But here in Ghana, like it's all Black folks for the most part, right? So in leadership positions and so on, is mostly Black men, even in education, which is really interesting because I think in the States we see women much more predominant in the field, whereas here it's men. And so I've just noticed the ways that women quiet themselves or allow men to speak over them in certain contexts in ways that I don't see Black women in the States do. And so that's been an interesting thing for me, right? Like, so socially, like social norms around how you communicate are different here. And I do think women don't want to be perceived as being difficult, which often Black women are, right? Especially if they say what they want to say. But here, even more so, I think it's not something people, aspire to be, women in particular. So that's been interesting, and I've tried to navigate my own experiences with patriarchy here, like really overt patriarchy, gracefully. But it's a steep learning curve. Again, I will say that how it shapes my identity is that it or reinforces my sense of self is that I still see the need for like deep liberatory education and healing work uh, here, the same that I saw 20 something years ago, and so that makes me feel like I'm in alignment. And like you said, with our shared Pan-Africanist values, it's like, okay, so I'm coming back and doing the work that I set out to do. And so in that way, it's reaffirming to who I am as a Black woman to be in this space, in this time, even with all its challenges.
And then we speak about liberatory education, whether it be in general or just in your current context. What does that look and sound like for you?
In general, it's self-determination, right? So providing space for people to have agency in their learning, in their social environments, in their life outside of school. And I think practically what that might look like in schools is something that I'm always going to be a big advocate for because it's been my experience is deeper learning, right? So opportunities for criticality, critical thinking, problem solving, creative problem solving, collaboration, uh, technology is huge, especially here. Like folks really need to have access to and know how to navigate technology. Also, I mean, I benefited from this. I double majored in college in English and African/African American studies. So I think ethnic and cultural studies is really important in liberatory education because, like again, because of my father and his little fun facts growing up, and then pursuing African studies, I've always equated Blackness with brilliance, or being of African descent with brilliance. And so I don't have to do a lot of unlearning around that. Some folks who don't have that, if you just rely on what you get in public education or even private education, as I've seen here, you are going to think poorly about who you are and who your people are and where you come from. So I think that's really important to liberatory education. And then as just a project-based learning practitioner and lover, I will say authentic learning experiences and assessments, right? Like really teaching students things that matter to them inside of school and outside of school that have impact on their communities, and then assessing them based on how they can solve these problems in these real life contexts. To me, I mean, those are some things for liberatory education that are top of mind.
And I'm sure those are some of the things that you try to implement in the workshops that you do through ASCD. So we know ASCD is an organization that's been in existence for years, particularly here in the States.
Mm-hmm.
But now there's a branch in Ghana that's
Mm-hmm.
doing some work, and you're very much in the thick of it as a professional learning director. So, based on all that you've shared about some of the areas where teachers can grow in Ghana,
Mm-hmm.
and knowing what you know about the state of professional development in the country, how would you characterize the progress that's been made with regard to professional development for teachers in Ghana?
So yes, Ghana ASCD is an affiliate of ASCD in the States, and just still kind of getting our footing, I would say, in the professional development work here in Ghana, but I can share some of the things that we've been working on. And I'm still very new to Ghana, and I'm still learning about how teachers and leaders receive professional development. But from what I've seen so far, Ghana has a lot of private schools that range from being very low resource to incredibly high resource, like a private university, like an Ivy League university kind of resource. So for the more resource schools, they can fly in consultants from the UK, from Australia, and get these wonderful, week-long professional learning experiences and throughout the year. For lower resource schools, and I would say public schools as well, they may or may not get PD from what I'm seeing each year. There are some other organizations around who are doing things to beef up professional learning for schools, but it varies, I will say. And I think what I've seen largely is kind of whole systems PD. Like this is what we want for all of Ghana, and so they give the same PD to everyone, which is fine if we're trying to really talk about systems change. And I don't see as much kind of tailored to what people at a particular site and what their particular context is. I don't see PD tailored to those needs. From my limited purview, I'll say that. In Ghana ACD, since I've joined, which has been just over a year now, we have worked on a few initiatives to really support professional learning. One is consulting with the Ministry of Education, and we just launched a pilot of the National Educational Leadership Institute, which is a program, yes, amazing, so exciting, a program to train aspiring school leaders, agency leaders, regional directors, all in transformational leadership, which is huge. And our approach is really cool. We're doing flipped learning. We have job embedded performance assessments, so those authentic assessments. We're using a lot of technology, and we're doing really cool things. So I'm excited about that. Huge labor of love for sure. And then we're planning a conference for next July here in Accra, July 5th through 7th, called Reimagining Education for the Future We Seek, a dialogue with Ghana and the world. And we have 5 different conference strands around like technology, wellness, developing student leaders, leadership, and so on. And we're really excited to bring in an international group of educators so that we can learn and grow together. So we hope this will be a major contribution. And then we've done some other things. We've had some leadership conversations where we invite school leaders to come in, and we talked about issues in leadership. And then we're going to be launching Saturday Institutes once a month for newer teachers, for more seasoned teachers, and for leaders. Different topics to support folks, and hopefully, they're accessible at the price point that we're offering it at. So those are some things that we're trying to do to support professional learning here.
Which I think is amazing, because one thing that I've even noticed in the different African countries I've been in is that professional development is very much an equity issue.
Oh, yes.
Very much so. And you see it with international schools. Like the international schools and even the private schools are able to fly in the consultants and the experts to facilitate PD sessions for extended period of time. And then if you're not in those type of settings and you don't have the same kind of resources and facilities, you're lucky if you have someone come do a one-stop shop type of PD, but that's something that happens periodically. It's not something that's even guaranteed. And that just impacts everybody, not just that school, but it impacts the country in large when you're not able to provide that equity in that professional learning space. It's much needed. So I'm so happy that Ghana ASCD is working towards that, because it's necessary, especially now.
Yeah, and I will say too, from my purview, it's another legacy of colonialism, right? Because here they just want teachers to teach a certain way. It's sit and get for students and teachers lecture. Like they're not trying to improve pedagogy in any way. Like that hasn't been until recently. That hasn't been definitely a national focus until recently. So there's a lot to disrupt here for sure, and a lot of folks who are ready to do that work. So that's really exciting. Feels like a good time to be here.
Yeah, and I know we've been talking a lot about the teachers, but also thinking about the students. Hopefully, we get to a place where we go from doing things in a teacher-centered manner to a more student-centered manner,
Absolutely.
where it's not only about students building their agency and having opportunities to do that, but also students being able to play the role as co-curators and co-creators of their learning experience alongside teachers. That's the big shift that I think has to happen for sure.
Yes.
But I know that's going to take some time.
Just a little bit, but
A little bit.
we're on it, planting seeds.
Yes, yes. But before you go, I just have a couple more questions.
Mm-hmm.
First one being, what keeps you hopeful in your pursuit for liberation and justice for marginalized folks in the learning spaces that they're in?
The general awakening that it seems we're experiencing globally is what keeps me hopeful. And I say general because I think it's to varying degrees. And I attribute some of it to social media, right? And the way people have access to information they didn't have before. Sometimes it's misinformation, a lot of times, but sometimes, it's things that they genuinely wouldn't learn about otherwise. And it plants seeds, and it also creates ways for people to communicate and organize towards liberation much easier than years past, right? And so that keeps me hopeful, because I do see young people becoming like radicalized much earlier than, some of my peers were, because we have this access. So that keeps me hopeful.
And then my final question for you will be, how does Dr. Laureen Adams stay true to the teacher in her?
By staying in community with educators, trying to always learn and grow in my understanding, approach, and practice. And I guess I'll underscore the grow, like having a growth mindset to, trying things that are new. Also knowing that what might have worked with learners, whether they're young people or adults, 2 years ago might not work anymore. And maybe it's not comfortable for me to shift, but I need to if I want to meet their needs. So having a growth mindset and staying in community with educators for sure.
Awesome. Lori, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us. This has been a dope conversation, a long time coming.
Yes, thank you.
And of course, can't let you leave without letting people know how they can connect with you on social media, or if you have a website that you want to share, if you
Mhm.
want to let people know about your services, because you do go to different countries and different schools to provide consulting professional development. Let them know some of the other work you do.
Oh, thank you. So yes, I have a website, laureenadams.com or liberatorylove.com. It takes you to the same place. And I do professional learning. I do leadership coaching as well. Help develop learning materials. Some people say curriculum and so on. I am on LinkedIn under Laureen Adams, on Instagram at Laureen Adams PH.D, and also on Facebook at Laureen Adams. And I think those are all of them.
And if you don't get those handles, you can just go right to the website and you'll find everything there. All right, friend. Thank you so much for coming
Thank-
on. And you already know we gonna connect soon.
Yes, we are. Thank you
All
too.
right, take care.
You too. Be well.
All right, y'all. So we're about to end another episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live. And as always, I wish you a good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're gonna do this again another time. Peace out, y'all.